So about 3 years ago, I sat in a meeting with Representative Adam Gardner, who was leaving the Utah State Legislature after having been elected to the position of Salt Lake County Recorder. And he asked my team if we would consider taking on a project that he had started with Senator Todd Weiler and wanted to continue after he left. He didn't want it to just die on the vine since he was not in the legislature anymore. The project was getting approval from the Utah State Legislature through a resolution to create a statue of Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon and install it in National Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol building. To put Martha in National Statuary Hall, we would need to remove an existing statue of Philo T. Farnsworth, because in the Capitol, each state has 2 statues that they select to represent them, and we were not crazy enough to think that we could unseat Brigham Young. Literally, unseat him. These statues can be rotated out every 10 years, according to the Capitol architects, and there were several reasons to pursue sending Martha to Washington. First, Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon was the first female state senator elected anywhere in the nation, elected to the first Utah State Legislature after Utah became a state in 1896. Secondly, if we timed it right, the Martha statue could be unveiled in the Capitol in August of 2020, right at the same time that the nation is commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, or the Suffrage Amendment, which extended voting rights to women across the nation. And that was a movement that Martha worked particularly hard on, and the amendment was something that she believed in personally. Additionally, the Philo T. Farnsworth statue has been in the Capitol for over 35 years, and while Farnsworth, as the inventor of early tubing technology that led to the creation of the television, is an amazing representative of Utah, where he spent his college years and early career, he was raised in Rigby, Idaho, and lived many places across the nation as an adult. In fact, there are more elementary schools named after him in Idaho than there are in Utah, and Representative Gardner shared with us that there is a joke among the Capitol tour guides that every state gets 2 statues in National Statuary Hall except Idaho, which has 3. In addition, Philo has 6 other statuary representations of himself, other places in the country, and countless numbers of plaques and identifiers of places that he lived and worked. But of course, the most important reason to attempt to represent Utah with a statue of Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon is because doing so allows us to expand our vision of who built Utah and the nation to include lesser-known contributors. As Ashley Whitaker reminded us this morning, progress requires risk. And in this project, we were asking the Utah State Legislature to take a risk to move us forward in our representation of the builders of Utah and the nation. I hope this isn't going to be a problem. Representative Gardner knew that my group, Better Days 2020, was uniquely positioned to take on this project. When he first visited us, we were a very small new nonprofit that was looking for a big project to put us on the map. We were moving towards the 2020 anniversaries of both Utah and the nation, and we knew we only had a little bit of time to really make our mark, which is a tough ask for a nonprofit that usually requires years of build-up and advocacy to get the funding it needs, not to mention the awareness that it needs. I co-founded the group when a friend and I recognized that Utah women were the first women in the nation to vote under an equal suffrage law, and that 2020, actually next week, would be the 150th anniversary of that first female vote. My co-founder and I were both transplants to Utah, and we could not believe that we were completely unaware of this inspiring fact, and even those who had been born and raised in the Utah school systems were usually unaware of this inspiring fact. We also recognized that 2020 would mark the centennial of the 19th Amendment, and we thought that this was a wonderful opportunity to combat some of the mainstream media articles that we were seeing around the same time that identified Utah as the worst state for women based on a series of metrics, mostly focused on political, economic, and educational statistics. We felt that we could not let 2020 go by without reminding Utahns and the nation of Utah women's legacy and leadership of activism. In the 3 years since starting Better Days 2020, we have attacked our mission of popularizing Utah women's history through education, legislation, public art, and events. We acted on the theory that exposure to the remarkable and previously unknown history of Utah women's activism would expand our vision for ourselves as Utahns. It would prompt us to ask ourselves how well we've lived up to their legacy and commit ourselves to doing better in the future. It would give women and girls examples from their own community that they can aspire to be like. It would challenge national stereotypes and offer a different narrative about what it means to be a Utah woman. And most importantly, we wanted to release Utah women and girls from the self-fulfilling prophecy presented to them by national media articles and narratives that they are held back. Our theories have proven overwhelmingly successful. We have trained over 1,000 teachers on our educational curriculum. We have provided magnetic school classroom materials that are being used throughout the state. We have published 3 books, commissioned artwork and songs, hosted countless events. Our exhibit of 50 illustrations of Utah women's advocates by Brooke Smart is traveling the state in 12 different locations and has a permanent exhibit this year on the 4th floor of the Utah State Capitol building. And classroom surveys show that when we present Utah women's history in curricula, attitudes among both boys and girls about the capabilities and potential of girls jump as much as 30 percentage points. You all have on your seats, hopefully, or you can find one, a sticker or a magnet from the campaign that my team has rolled out across the state of Utah now for this special year of 2020. This is the Utah Heritage Campaign, and Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon is one of the 9 women that we are featuring in this campaign, this public awareness campaign right now in the state. Ultimately, we ask audiences whether or not we have lived up to the legacy of these early Utah suffragists and their male allies. This statement by Franklin Richards is one that represents a vast body of statements and philosophies expressed by the early LDS leaders of Utah, both male and female. And we ask ourselves all the time, and we ask our audiences in Utah, if we have lived up to this legacy of having advocacy for women be our brightest and purest ray of Utah's glorious star, and if it is helping us fulfill the measure of civil and religious liberty. So Martha is part of this effort to put forward examples of Utah womanhood that offer a different narrative for Utahns and the nation. Our own Laurel Thatcher Ulrich famously wrote that well-behaved women seldom make history, and we might think it would be impossible to find a history-making woman among our well-behaved membership. But if we think that, we simply have not yet met the Utah Mormon suffragists of the late 19th century. Martha Hughes Cannon traveled with her family at a young age from Wales to the Salt Lake Valley with the Mormon pioneers. Several deaths in her immediate family along the way inspired her to pursue medicine once she reached the Saints' permanent home. With the support of her community, Maddie Hughes received 4 degrees by the age of 24, a chemistry degree at the University of Deseret, now the University of Utah, a medical degree from the University of Michigan in 1881, a degree in pharmaceuticals from the University of Pennsylvania in 1882, and while in Pennsylvania, she simultaneously attended the National School of Elocution and Oratory in Philadelphia. Once she returned to Salt Lake, she set up a private medical practice and became the resident physician of the all-women-run Deseret Hospital. In 1896, directly after Utah became a state, and in the first election open to female candidates, Martha was elected to the Utah State Senate, becoming the first female state senator in the nation. During her 4 years in the Utah State Legislature, Maddie continued to practice medicine and proposed several legislative bills that revolutionized public health in Utah and in the West. She established the first state board of health. She legislated for regulations around contagious diseases and vaccines, and she established protections for the blind and the deaf, including the first school in Utah for the blind and the deaf. Her study of bacteria made her a tireless advocate for sewers and sanitation. And she shaped Utah and the rise of healthy communities in the West as we know them today. As a suffrage leader, Maddie testified to the U.S. congressional committees on Utah women's suffrage work to show them that the domestic sphere did not collapse if women were allowed to express themselves in the political sphere, and was a featured speaker at the Women's Congress of the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. She also was a speaker at the 1898 Seneca Falls 50th celebration of the launch of the women's suffrage movement in Washington, D.C. And by the end of her time in the legislature, Martha Hughes Cannon was even tagged as the new state's best hope for a congressional seat in Washington. So after Representative Gardner entrusted Better Days 2020 with this project, we learned that Martha, if inducted in August of 2020 as we hoped, would be the 10th woman in National Statuary Hall. But before we got there, we would have to find sponsors in the state's legislative house and Senate to support a resolution. The resolution would state that the Utah State Legislature would approve the placement of Martha as Utah's second statue in the U.S. Capitol building, and that no taxpayer funds would be used to create the statue. Wonder what is going on here. There we go. You can see here, these are some pictures over here. These are some pictures of the Utah State House with Representative Becky Edwards, who was our House representative for the resolution, speaking there in that far picture. And you might notice in this near picture that some of the representatives are wearing yellow roses. If you know the history of the suffrage movement, you know the yellow rose was an important symbol with a wonderful story about the yellow rose specifically taking place in Tennessee at the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So we used that as a symbol, and we handed those yellow roses out, and we were able to identify our champions on the floor before the vote took place. And this was important because, surprisingly, the vote to send Martha to Washington was actually very, very tight. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later about the bitter and highly publicized conversation that took place as the legislature was debating whether or not to send Martha to Washington. But you can see here that it was a packed house the day that the House actually voted to send Martha, and the reactions from the scores of little girls in the balcony certainly made us feel like it was all worth it. Surprisingly, the vote whether or not to send Martha to Washington became a leading story of the 2018 legislative session, and we were not sure about the outcome, but we were grateful when both the Senate and the House passed the resolution overwhelmingly. So at this point, I'd like to actually tell you about the statue itself and show you a video. There was a committee assigned to select an artist for the statue, and they went through a nationwide exhaustive process. They ended up with 5 candidates. There were 3 men and 2 women. All 3 men were from Utah, and both of the 2 women were not from Utah. So we did settle on a man, a Utah man, who has done extensive work in female figures, and his name is Ben Hammond, and he's been absolutely delightful to work with. And I actually had a chance to go to his home recently and have him show you the statue that he's working on. So I'm going to play about 8-minute video, and then I'll be back. We'll see if the sound works. Okay. Any ideas here?
exactly like her, but between the two great-granddaughters, I've gotten little features that look similar.
Yeah.
So that's been nice. But mostly, she was barely 5 feet tall, and so usually you'll go life and a quarter size for Statuary Hall. I've decided to make her life and almost life and a half, not quite.
Oh,
Because
interesting.
I didn't want her to be even though certain people thought, well, it'd be neater to have this diminutive lady that's really strong. And I'm like, if it's going to say strong, you can't, all I can communicate with is visually, so I can't explain like she was small but strong. So I'm like, if I want to show a strong woman, it needs to be as big as the male statues too. So she's the same scale as the other statues in there.
Interesting.
And so that was important to me to make her that 7.5 feet tall. Another thing that's kind of interesting that I'm trying to show her strength is I'm actually overemphasizing her hands, not scale-wise, but muscular-wise. Like instead of making it just a real soft, subtle hand like I usually do on a female figure, I am trying to make it just a little bit stronger. So even though it's relaxed and holding a book, I still want it to feel really sculptural and strong, just because that's another one of those visual elements that I have to work with to kind of communicate what type of person she was with visual elements.
What book is she holding? Is it a specific book?
No, it can be, I was thinking of maybe it's her journal, whatever, and I'm just like, the less I say is probably the better, because I want people to be able to relate. They can guess whatever it is. Is it a book about, with laws and things? Because it's supposed to be her as her term in the state legislature as a senator. But I don't know, maybe it's her personal journal, maybe it's, who knows what it is.
And what about the inspiration for the dress? Is that from a specific photo? Or?
Well, most of her dresses that she wore at the time were so busy they'd be distracting.
Yeah.
So I wanted it to be fancy, so I worked with a historical dressmaker that I just said, and one thing about Martha is she was very big in fashion. She wanted to be fashionable, because she was also self-conscious of the fact that, I'm from Utah, people are thinking we're backwards and things like that. So when I go into the big cities, so like when she went through Chicago on her way out to med school, she had a dress made for her, because she's like, I want the latest fashion, so I'm not just some country bumpkin. And she always felt that way. So when she came back, she was very aware of the styles. Obviously, she's going to be a little more conservative in her style, like the sleeve, that was when women, if you look at John Singer Sargent paintings with a lot of women during that time, the short sleeves were in fashion, but she always wore long sleeves, and she always had things done up to her neck. But it's still a very highly fashionable dress, so that's what we came up with. And we simplified some things and some of the stitching so it could be more about her, because the sleeves really would be even poofier, but I didn't want them to be the same size as her head, because that would detract from her portrait. And I want everything to be about looking up at her, trying to make that connection with her.
I love the flowers on the buttons. Those are wonderful. It's almost like the sago lily or the rose that we're trying to highlight in the campaign this year. The special flowers that were the symbol of the suffrage movement, and it's just sort of a damask. Is it a cummerbund here, or is it what do you call that piece?
Yeah, it's a cummerbund.
Yeah,
and
it's wonderful.
On the model, the cummerbund doesn't have any decorative design, but on the big piece, it just was too plain. So I've kind of thrown some like a paisley design. The actual cummerbund's like right here that we had made.
Oh, so you actually have you have something you can look at the folds. Oh yeah, look at that. Did you have this made then, so that you could do it?
We had it made and sized and fitted with the model that I used. So
is this the maquette over here?
Yes.
Okay.
So
So
that's
how
the
tall
scale
is
model.
this? This
That's
is the...
a 24 inch. It's
24
actually
inch.
25, but 24 inch
Okay.
figure.
And what's the material here? What is this made out of?
This is cast in resin.
Okay.
So the original clay is actually in the other room, and the clay gets damaged after you make a mold of it. So I poured this resin cast so I could have that to reference.
And what happens now to this clay version?
Okay, I've got about another month to be finishing up on this, and I'll need every second of that month to get it done to where I'm happy with it. But then it'll be taken apart, like the head comes off.
I was noticing there's some seams in here.
Yeah.
You're going to take her head off for us? Oh, right. Wow. Okay.
So the head comes off so I can work on it separately and focus on the portrait. And then just below the book, there's another seam. I won't lift that off because
Yes,
I need 2 people to do
that.
it. And then it'll be sectioned off again, and probably about 15 different sections,
Okay.
molded sections, and those will be sent to the foundry, and then we'll start casting it in bronze. And then they'll weld those 15 sections together, and we'll have a bronze that will head out to Washington.
And you're using the foundry here in Springville, is that right?
Yeah, bare bronze will be
Bare
cast
bronze.
in. So, and then hopefully we can make a couple other castings for other places.
Yeah, I know. We're trying to work with the town in Wales where she was born.
Yeah.
See if we can send one there. That would be exciting.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Molly and Carrie.
Can you say you're welcome, Molly?
Okay, Molly, what are you working on? Is this still your snake? You a Spider-Man?
Yes, Spider-Man is just drawing his baby.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks, Molly. So, it was as I referenced, it was a much harder fight than we anticipated in the legislature. And I'll explore this a little bit more later, but I was personally shocked at the bitterness that dominated the conversations. After the successful vote in the House, one representative who had only begrudgingly voted to support the statue came up to my team and said to us, "You women have a problem if you think you need a statue to feel good about yourselves." So, at this point, I'd like to take a step back and ask, what is the purpose of a statue like this? What is the purpose of memorials or of public art specifically? And is it to help people feel good about themselves? So let's start by understanding what we mean when we say public art. Public art is defined as any media that has been planned and created with the express intention of existing in the physical public domain. Public art is often outside, but not always, and is usually accessible to all. I'm speaking today about representational art, so images of people specifically, although not always specific people. But this is only one type of public art. One scholar describes public art as humanizing the built environment. It provides intersection between past, present, and future, between disciplines and ideas. So we will be hearing from some official art historians today and some official artists, of which I am not one. But I would also suggest that public art both reflects and forms our communal values. The things we choose to turn into memorials or to commemorate in public art are representations of what we hold important as a community. This seems like a rather obvious point. We choose to immortalize those people and events that we deem critical to shaping who we are and what we value. Military strength, diplomacy, inventiveness are often criteria, and memorials and public art are dedicated to these people or ideals and are a form of propaganda, propagating community appreciation or admiration. But public art can also speak forward to future generations about what we think they too should value. If our children see us highlighting certain people or values in our public art, they take cues from that, recognizing that those are things that they too should deem as worthy of admiration. We see this, of course, working in reverse as well. Future generations can reject the people and values prior generations chose to highlight in their public art, enacting a dismissal of the old attitudes or perspectives. You've probably read about some of these stories in the news in the past decade or so. My own alma mater, Yale University, has recently renamed a residential college because of this attitude. And this valuation can be distorted, too, when we turn admiration of a person into hero worship, simplifying their accomplishments and whitewashing their faults. So let's overlay a gender lens on our examination of public art. What role do women play in public art in America? Traditionally, the representation of women in American public art has been almost exclusively limited to metaphor. Lady Liberty, Lady Justice, Lady Wisdom, Lady Freedom, these are not real women. They are idealized and often literally pedestalized women that perpetuate an otherness in the way we perceive women. They are frozen in time, devoid of human personality or complications. And interestingly, a Utah Supreme Court Justice, Judge Orlando Powers, actually suggested while Martha was in the legislature that a statue be created of her at that time. And he said, and listen to how he describes his vision of that statue at the end of the 19th century. "She is a brave and brilliant woman," he said. "If I could raise a statue to Liberty in the figure of the gallant little woman who represents us in the Senate, I would place it there." So he didn't say he would like a statue of Martha herself. He said he'd like a statue of liberty in the figure of Martha. The concept of an object of public admiration actually representing a real woman was apparently even outside of the realm of imaginative propositions at that time. Of the estimated 5,193 public statues depicting historic figures on display on street corners and parks throughout the United States, only 394 of these monuments are of women, including this one of Eleanor Roosevelt. That's 7.5%, and compounding this number, none of the 44 memorials maintained by the National Park Service, like the Lincoln Memorial or the Thomas Jefferson Memorial, specifically focus on women. And famously, in my hometown of New York City, Central Park, with all of its statues and memorials, includes only one statue of a woman, Alice in Wonderland. When that Utah State Senator asked me if I needed a statue of a woman to feel good about myself, he was not acknowledging the vast well of subconscious confidence that is every man's birthright, that comes from seeing other men raised up in almost every representation of power and success. From men on dollar bills to men astride bronze horses to portraits of men in college libraries and government buildings, our visual vocabulary of notable things, the things we want to pass down from generation to generation, is almost exclusively male. So let's look further at this by taking National Statuary Hall as a proxy for women's representation in public memorials. So this is where Martha is going, and there are currently 9 women out of 100 statues, beating the general US ratio of the street corner statue slightly, so 9% as opposed to 7.5%. You'll notice here, this is 4 of the 9 women, and just to summarize briefly, we have 1 child, Helen Keller, and 3 of the 9 women are Native American women who are noted because of their translation and diplomacy skills in getting the white men what they wanted. And there are only 3 women out of the 9 who are not firsts, meaning that we have the first woman in Congress, Jeanette Rankin, we have the first woman in the Johns Hopkins Medical School class, et cetera. But there are only 3 out of these 9 women who are not firsts. So here we come up against a second truth about public memorials. The first truth is that subjects reflect and shape our values. But secondly, they also represent people who function on the public stage. They represent people who rise to the top financially, politically, and educationally. And so, of course, we come up with the classic conundrum that until recently, women did not function on the public stage. And this is one of the main reasons that we are telling the story of the national women's suffrage movement, because the suffrage movement was never just about voting. The suffrage movement was about women crossing the threshold from the domestic sphere into the public sphere, and the movement gave them a platform to organize, educate themselves, speak publicly in mixed companies, write and express opinions, and it was their grand orchestrated entrance onto the public stage. In our day and age, as we choose to memorialize, to reflect our values as a community, it is not sufficient to perpetuate the falsehood that only men participate on the public stage. But when we reach into history to find public players to admire and hold up as examples of our values, we are by definition limited in the women who meet our threshold. Because women's entrance onto the public stage happened so recently, many of the women we choose to hold up qualify for that honor because they were the first at something. And by selecting them, we show that we admire their perseverance in the face of adversity, their confidence in traveling new paths, and their willingness to push themselves farther than was expected. But women's entrance into public life retreats, as women's entrance into public life retreats farther and farther into the distant past, it will become easier to identify and honor real women who might not be the first to do something, but who, like men, contribute to the health and well-being of our community in diverse and meaningful ways. In the meantime, though, we have to look harder and be willing to elevate women of the past, like Martha, who shaped the world we lived in today without us even realizing it. So we've looked at women in public art generally, so let's drill down now into LDS women in public art. So let's put not only the gender lens, but the religion the religion lens on top of this as well, and ask ourselves how and to what extent are Latter-day Saint women represented in public art. So we have our two principles, that public art both reflects and shapes our communal values, and that public memorials most often reflect actors on the public stage, and that women did not enter the public sphere in a mainstream way until recent history. So are those true principles still true when we look at art within the church? So I'm not offering here by any means a full survey of representational art of women offered to the LDS public. And to be clear, art representing LDS women is different than art created by LDS women, which of course we are seeing, absolute riches of here in this exhibit today, in this festival, and is becoming better recognized and rewarded throughout the church, as it should. This center and the conference use the definition that LDS art is art that is made by artists who happen to be LDS. And so in the spirit of narrowing that focus for this discussion and following the example of Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon, the statue, I am interested in public art that happens to represent LDS women, either because of their church membership or regardless of it. And I'm not talking about biblical figures either. I'm talking about art that memorializes the impact of specific LDS women. So I'll give you a moment to see if you can come up with a piece of public art that memorializes the contributions of a specific LDS woman. Spoiler alert, there aren't many. This type of public art is almost non-existent. So, as we did with National Statuary Hall, let's look at Temple Square as a proxy for this examination. So applying these first two principles, does the art on Temple Square reflect and shape our communal values? I would answer yes, of course, because of the stringent approval process and very controlled process. The church fully intends to pass along common values and priorities. Our focus through the art on Temple Square is continually drawn to key events in gospel history, specifically events that set us apart from other religious traditions, the restoration of the priesthood, the journey of the pioneers, etc. These are intended to bind the community through common narrative. So the second principle, does the art on Temple Square reflect actors on the public stage? Not as much. So really, if you do a survey of public art on Temple Square, it's limited to divine beings, prophets, and families. And so the vast majority of our public art that includes women, of which I'm showing the three examples on Temple Square here, are of nameless women, much like justice and freedom. They are women who represent idealized qualities, pioneer grit, saintly motherhood. And interestingly, even the Minerva Teichert paintings in the conference center, many of which feature women, still feature only biblical women or nameless women, such as her famous one of her, the pioneer woman raising her fist. So they're gorgeous, of course, and powerful, but they don't represent specific named women. So interestingly, this is a little bit of a side note, but the exception to this on Temple Square is in the Relief Society building, which is, I think, the most undervalued and undervisited building on Temple Square. But it does house portraits of all the General Relief Society presidents. An interesting fact about this is that the portraits, which started off as fine art works, move into studio portrait photography with Barbara Winder in 1984, and may indicate that these are intended to be functional rather than works of art. So do they qualify as public art if they say Busath on the bottom rather than a fine art painter? On the church's website featuring the portraits, the artist is no longer attributed once they move from paintings to photos. And incidentally, this shift coincides with the evolution from the era of General Relief Society presidents serving for decades in their position to, such as Belle Spafford here in the middle, who served as General Relief Society president for 30 years, to the practice of today, which is to release the presidency after 5 years exactly. So, because this is near and dear to my heart, because I did work on the I'm a Mormon project, I think a lot about this, how we represent our women to the public. And I think it's worth exploring that in the church we present our women publicly in two very problematic ways. First, we have held up women who impact the public sphere when our culture and even our doctrine required women not to participate in the very visible activities that would merit them a public artistic memorialization. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to actually use my own mother. Some of you may recognize that this is a portrait that was done of my mother, who was an opera singer, Ariel Bybee, and it hung in the Harris Fine Arts Center for 15 years. I am the very first one to say that I am who I am today because the church nurtured my mother professionally. It admired her, it put her out as an example. And so I was raised with the very deep-seated assumption that when women exercise their professional capabilities and fulfill their potential in a professional setting, they will only be praised and admired for it. That was the way the church functioned in my life as the daughter of a professional woman. And my mother was held up as a public figure in a public art memorialization in the Harris Fine Arts Center on BYU for many years. I was very keen as I grew up, keenly aware of the hypocrisy of this, though, as I became older and recognized that the entire time I was growing up, and that my mother was pursuing her international career, President Benson was asking women to come home. Secondly, when we do put out specific women to the general public, we represent them in less permanent media, using them more as proselytizing or advertising tools rather than artistic conveyors of value. The church has improved tremendously over the past decade or so in highlighting the activities and impacts of our female members, but they are represented in the media of choice today, digital media and specifically video, with representations in fine art or more permanent art still almost non-existent. And I will say that having spent 5 years on the I'm a Mormon campaign and countless blood, tears, and money, it was a little disheartening to have to search so hard on YouTube for any remnants of the I'm a Mormon campaign. Many of these women have kind of faded away that we worked hard to emphasize. So I'd like to turn back to Martha Hughes Cannon. She is going to be lasting and permanent. But selecting Martha Cannon for a lasting, high-profile fine art offering isn't without its problems either. I gave a very brief description, brief biography of Martha earlier. Let me tell you more about her. Martha Cannon was the fourth polygamous wife of Angus Cannon. In 1896, when she ran in that first election open to women and became the first female state senator in the nation, she ran as a Democrat against her husband, who ran on the Republican ticket. Martha had married Angus in 1884 at the height of the federal government's crackdown on polygamy. Angus was 23 years older than her, with 3 other wives and 17 children. Believe it or not, this was a marriage of love. Both of them declared that till the day they died. And although Maddie would be extremely open in her writings and her letters about how painful plural marriage was for her personally. If you know anything about the history of polygamy, you know that the late 19th century, the 80s and the 90s were a really fraught time for the polygamous families of Utah. Federal officers conducted raids and arrested Angus and convicted him of living illegally with several women. Martha, pregnant with a child that could be used as proof for charges against Angus, joined as many other polygamous wives did, and she went underground. In the winter of 1886, she assumed a new name and left for England with her daughter in tow. About 14 years later, the polygamous crackdown of that particular time period had passed. Maddie returned to Utah, and 14 years after her exile to England, she became the state senator. She once again, while she was in the legislature, found out that she was pregnant. She was at the height of her political career. You might have remembered that early on when I gave the very top-level version of her story, I mentioned that she was being tagged as Utah's representative to Congress. But to be found pregnant in 1899 through a polygamous union was a horrible scandal. In this post-manifesto Utah, men such as Angus had had to choose only one wife, with others left out in the cold to fend for themselves and their children declared bastards. As the fourth wife, Martha was expected to have relinquished Angus, and he her, but a pregnancy was proof that they were still acting as husband and wife. Her personal life clashed painfully with her very public political life, and Maddie was forced again to go into exile, this time to California. Gwendolyn Cannon, the baby in this picture, was born in 1899. Maddie called Gwendolyn her and Angus's gift of love to each other, but Martha's political career was over. For the next 30 years, she dedicated herself to raising Gwendolyn and various grandchildren in both California and Utah while continuing her medical practice. She wrote to Angus at one point, "From day to day, I wonder what I have done to merit such punishment, and attempted to hold on too long and to do too much. While educating the children, I should have given up sooner and sought help earlier. As it was, I kept on, taking stimulants of various kinds to keep up. My poor heart will not beat at all. I am altogether a miserable wreck." In 1928, when Gwendolyn was 29 years old, she contracted tuberculosis and died. Her physician mother was powerless. So I ask you, are these the values we want to represent us in a communal offering to public art? Do you feel differently about honoring Martha publicly and permanently after knowing all of this about her? Plenty of people objected to all of this when we presented the request for the statue 2 years ago. Fierce debate raged in the legislature about whether we are comfortable as a state having a polygamous wife represent us to the nation. The actions of the radical Utah suffragists have been buried in part because we are ashamed of their marital status. And there were plenty of people who wanted to continue silencing this woman because of who she was married to. No one seemed concerned about the fact that our other statue, Brigham Young, was also in a polygamous marriage. But for me, these are the things that make me love Martha even more. These are the things that make her worthy of public adoration, and why she embodies qualities that I want the next generation to remember. Because if we put Martha in the US Capitol building because she was the only woman in her medical school and the first female state senator, we are raising her to a place of honor because she competed in the men's game and she won the men's game. She got her accolades and she broke barriers, and that is wonderful. But Martha also fought her battle on a field that is uniquely female. Getting pregnant at 42 and having your career derailed because of it does not happen to men. I'm crying because last week, a dear friend wrote me from halfway around the world telling me that she is pregnant at 42 while running a global company and struggling in her marriage. She wrote to me to ask me what she should do, knowing full well as a person of faith that I would tell her to keep the child. Martha is a memorial to the women every day all around the world who make that choice. Martha wrestled with the crucible of plural marriage that was and is unique to Latter-day Saint women. But our relationship with others, specifically with our husbands and children, have historically limited the public lives of women everywhere. As long as we remain primary caregivers, we wrestle with a balance that is uniquely female. Martha didn't settle for the either-or model of womanhood, either being a good wife and mother or a career girl. She embraced the both-and model that more and more of us have open to us today. We can be both a good mother and a politician, a wife and a doctor. Martha was an exceptional Latter-day Saint woman. She is every Latter-day Saint woman. Seeing those qualities raised to the public eye and heralded in such a rarefied setting means the world to me. Thank you.